So welcome back. Decided that I would do a quick overview of working with fiberglass and how I glass in the stringers and things like that in the boat. A little bit of a basic fiberglass overview to begin with for anybody that's new to it. There are other types of resins that people use, because basically when you're doing fiberglass work, you have two components. You have the fiberglass cloth of various types, and then you also have the resin that you saturate it with, which then hardens and creates the composite surface, the fiberglass material. So there are two most commonly used resins. There are other ones that are on the market now, and I won't go into them simply because I haven't used them. But the two most common ones are polyester resin as well as epoxy. And the two of them are quite a bit different to use. They're quite a bit different in price. They both have advantages and disadvantages. Now, to begin with, I'm using polyester resin. I do have some epoxy in a small can that I'm going to use for something else, but that's going to be for later, not for fiberglass work actually, but I do have some epoxy a little bit in the house. Epoxy is used by a lot of people for general boat repairs because it kind of sticks to anything. You don't have to do as much surface preparation. You don't have to be as careful with the type of cloth you use. But it also has disadvantages in price, first of all. Also, if you've done a repair with epoxy, you are now forced to do any further repairs that contact that repair with epoxy as well, because polyester resin will not stick to epoxy. The other thing about epoxy is that you can use it for coating, for waterproofing surfaces without using any kind of cloth, because it will retain its integrity and not crack very easily, so it will waterproof things. And that's actually what I'm going to use epoxy for, is on some wood surfaces that I just want to waterproof without putting cloth on them. Polyester resin is considerably less expensive than epoxy. Most older boats are made with polyester resin, so there's certainly nothing wrong with it. You do have to do a little more surface preparation before you apply new polyester resin and fiberglass to an old fiberglass surface, but that's a good idea to do anyway. You have to use some type of fiberglass cloth in any application of polyester resin or fiberglass reinforcement, because it will crack with time otherwise. But overall, it's not bad to work with. You do need to have the proper safety equipment because it does stink, so you need a mask, a proper mask that can handle organic vapors, not just dust mask. Good idea to wear some good gloves. I use these heavy-duty gloves that I buy, disposable gloves, because I've tried the thin ones and they just shred right away. As soon as the resin gets on, they stick to something and it just takes chunks out of them. There's no point wearing them. Make sure you have, rags and cleanup materials nearby, and work in a ventilated space as much as you can. If you're in an enclosed area, make sure you wear a mask and don't stay there for very long. Get a little bit done and get out. That's just common sense safety precautions. In terms of the surface preparation of the fiberglass, of the old fiberglass, before using polyester resin and fiberglass to adhere to it, what I do is I use either a grinder or a sander, and make sure I remove any of the old dirty stuff off the top, get down to clean fiberglass, and then give it a good wipe with acetone just before I start applying the fiberglass. This removes any oils or other things like that, so that the new fiberglass will stick to the old stuff. I haven't had any problems with it when I do it that way. In terms of fiberglass cloth, whenever you're using the polyester resin, this doesn't apply with epoxy, but with fiberglass resin, if you're applying new fiberglass to the old fiberglass of your boat, you need to apply a fiberglass mat before you apply the fiberglass weave. Now, You can buy them separately. I don't bother with that. I use a biaxial weave fiberglass cloth that has a mat attached to it. So one side is like a weave, the other side is a mat. And then when you put it down, you'll just put the mat side against the existing surface with the weave on top. It's a one-step application. It's a lot easier to do. On the other hand, it is a fairly thick material because there's 2 layers of material, so it does use up a lot of resin. So you got to be prepared for that. I buy my polyester resin in 5-gallon pails because when you're getting into boat repairs, you use a lot more resin than you can imagine. The polyester resin itself is available in 2 types, waxed and unwaxed. The kind you buy at a normal hardware store, things like that, will be the waxed resin. It's designed with a wax that basically rises to the surface, gives it a nice shiny hard finish once it dries, once it cures, and then it makes it nice and sandable so you can paint it and all the rest of it. The problem with a waxed resin, it works just fine, but the problem with it is that you have to let it cure and then you have to sand the surface and wipe it down with acetone before you can add a second layer of fiberglass. So when you're building up multiple layers of fiberglass on your transom or your stringers or anything, doing laminations, you need to sand and wipe between every coat. There is another type of polyester resin that I buy. It's just unwaxed polyester resin, often called laminating resin. It doesn't have the wax content in it, otherwise it's identical to work with. The difference is that when it cures and stays tacky for a number of days because it doesn't have that wax content that makes it harden up at the surface. The nice part with this is if you're putting a layer of fiberglass down, you can let it cure, and later the same day or the next day, you can go put another layer of fiberglass on there without having to sand it down first. So this can really save a lot of mess and time and everything else and ends up with a better result. There is a additive that you can buy at the fiberglass supply places. It's basically a wax content. They call it air dry at the place I get it from, which you can put into your final layer of resin that will make the surface dry nice and hard and not sticky. Or what you can do is just use laminating resin for all your initial layups, and then on the last layer, if you have it, use some final waxed resin on the last coat, and that'll work just fine as well. Generally, at least with the resin that I'm using, you mix about 1% of the hardener as a catalyst into the resin. So I'm using the metric system, so if I do 1 liter of resin mixed up, which is a fair bit, but if it's 1 liter of resin mixed, I'll put 10 milliliters of the catalyst in it, of the MEKP. One thing to also be careful with is the hardener itself has a relatively limited shelf life. It's only good for a few months. So when you go to buy it, make sure that the batch that you get is a relatively recent batch. So the stuff I'm using right now was packaged last month. It has a date of, it's currently June. It was packaged in May. I checked the sticker on it when I bought it, so I know it's good. It's good. I know it's fresh. I have some hardener from over a year ago. It still works, but I have to use a lot more of it in there. And when I'm doing critical thing, I just bought a new batch of hardener for the last little bit of resin I had in a pail from last summer. Because I just want it to work. I don't want to end up with a sticky mess that doesn't cure. Basically what I do when I start getting the fiberglass, once I have the surfaces prepared, I cut the fiberglass cloth to the size I need. I test fit it nice and dry. At that point, then I wipe it down, the whole area down with acetone again, and then get the mask on and the rubber gloves on and start mixing the resin. I also make sure that I have some rags nearby. I also make sure that I have a brush ready to go. I just buy these cheap brushes at the dollar store, and I do my mixing into these measuring cups that I buy at the dollar store, because They have measurements on the side, so it's easy to know how much I'm mixing, and you can't do very many mixes in the bucket before it's junk, and you don't want to be mixing new resin in a bucket that you mixed some other stuff in 15 minutes ago, because it can kick off really fast because of the previous stuff starting to go. So you can end up with some interesting results. The warmer the weather, the faster it kicks off. If you notice your fiberglass resin getting hot in your hand once you've mixed it, you're mixing it too hot. You're mixing it with too much hardener. Back off on the hardener because it's not supposed to get hot. I've done it before and it's a mess. So I have the surface cleaned. I have the fiberglass cloth cut, ready to go. I start mixing the hardener. As soon as I have it mixed, what I usually do is I brush a layer of the resiner, the mixed resin, onto the surface that I'm putting the cloth on. Then I apply the cloth, put the cloth in place, and then I brush the resin on. Now on a vertical surface, I try brushing it from the top down because it's going to run down anyway, and doing fiberglass is in some ways just a messy job. There's nothing you can do about it. It's going to run down. You can't stop gravity. If you don't put enough resin on, you end up with a dry cloth and you end up with air gaps in it, and it's not very good, so you want it well saturated. So anyway, you can see in this video, that's what I do, and this is me fiberglass, putting the second layer of fiberglass cloth on the inside of the stringers where the fuel tank is going to sit. So I have it coming from the top of the stringer, coming down and wrapping onto the bottom of the hull. I put the put the polyester resin on, put the cloth on, saturate the cloth, and then I use this special little roller. It's a grooved roller, and you run it over, and that helps you push the cloth into the corners nicely and helps the air escape. Because it's ridged, it doesn't stick to the cloth. If you used a flat roller, it would just stick to the cloth and pull it off. The ridges allow you to put pressure on the cloth, but allow the air to escape. Anyway, after you're done, make sure you clean your roller well in a bucket of acetone, because if you don't, well, it's not going to work again. So cleaning up after you're done is very important. Otherwise, you're not going to be reusing those tools. So basically, yeah, that's what I do. I go along, and then you look for any kind of white spots in the cloth. That means you didn't get enough resin in there. Make sure you get everything saturated. Because otherwise what happens is if it dries, the surface will dry hard, and then you can't saturate it later because you can't get the resin in underneath those now impregnated fibers that are on the surface. So you need to get enough resin in there when you're doing it. And then just clean up your tools. My mask that I use, I put it back in a clean Ziploc bag that I keep the mask in, so it's not sitting in the fumes wherever I am, and so the charcoal cartridges on the thing don't get saturated with crud when I'm not using the mask. It's just a way to keep it clean. And then just let it cure. Go back in later and you'll get an idea of how long it takes before it's fully cured and it's nice and hard. I find that I go in there and do what I can, and then I leave for a couple hours. That way I'm not sitting in the fumes, and I give it a good chance to harden. I could try to do more glassing in one shot, but then it just gets really messy because there's nowhere clean to stand and you're just bumping into the other sticky stuff, and that's just not fun. So basically that gives you an overview of what I end up doing. Right. The other thing I wanted to show you, I know I mentioned it in some of my other videos, is how I tab the stringers in initially. So what I do is I cut the stringers, I test fit them, I make sure they're going to be the right height and everything else. Now what you want to do is you want the stringers to be, when you install them, to be basically floating just above the fiberglass hull so the wood is not contacting the hull. And so I do that by using little bits of wood or whatever and set the stringer in place. A lot of times I do 2 stringers at a time, like one on each side. And then I put some temporary pieces of wood across to hold the stringers nice and vertical and get all the positioning exactly right. So once I have the stringers in place, floating just above the hull, I cut some strips of fiberglass cloth, and I cut it wide enough so it'll run a couple inches up the stringer, a couple inches down onto the hull, 2 or 3 inches. It doesn't really matter at this point, just a little bit. Wider certainly doesn't hurt. And make sure, of course, that the hull has been properly cleaned before you do this, prepared for fiberglass. And then I apply these, but I apply them on the inside of the stringer, so that the side of the stringer that's closer to the center of the boat, so that it's on the kind of the downhill side of the stringer. And I do that the full length of both of the stringers. And make sure I don't leave any gaps. If there's little twigs of wood that I've used for supporting them, I might leave a gap there, but other than that, I just put these all in place and let them harden well, again using the laminating resin. Once the fiberglass that I put in there has cured, I get some, I go and mix some more fiberglass resin, but this time I use a thickener in it. And so you use this stuff that one of the trade names is Cabicil. It's actually like a fumed silica powder. It looks like white fluff, for lack of a better explanation. You can buy it, and I buy it in gallon buckets like this. So what I do is I will take, a half a liter of resin into a container, no hardener in it yet, and then stir in like a half a cup or cupful of chopped strand fiberglass that I also buy in little containers like this. Mix that into the resin. That's a reinforcement for the resin. And then I start pouring in a little bit at a time this fluffy powder, and it's a bit of a messy job, and you can stir it into the resin. So you want to stir it in a little bit at a time because it takes a while for it to mix in. And the idea is to get a sort of a medium thickness stuff, something that will kind of hold its shape but will still kind of flow. You keep mixing that until you end up with this kind of thick goo. And then when you're happy with that, then you mix in the appropriate amount of hardener for your original resin amount. So if you used half a liter of resin, you mix in the appropriate amount of hardener for that amount of resin. You don't look at the amount of goo you have in there. You're mixing for the resin, not for the full mix. As soon as you have the hardener in there, stir it in really, really well. It might take a little more strain because now you're mixing into a thickened goo rather than the liquid resin. And then what I do is I take like a little plastic spreader that you would use for either the kind you use for drywall mud or something that you use for doing body work on cars, little squeegee kind of things. And I go the full length of the stringer, and from the outside of the stringer, the side that hasn't been tabbed yet, I squeeze this goo in under the stringer. And you can see when you're doing this, you can watch the inside of the stringer, and you can see the fiberglass tabbing you put in kind of turn dark when the thickened resin mixture you're now squeezing in contacts it. And you do this the full length of it. Try not to leave any air gaps in there. Smooth the outside of it, that where you're putting it in with the squeegee when you're done. And you've now filled in the whole gap under the stringer. Try to make as smooth of a surface on the outside as you can when you're done. Once that's hardened, you can go along and now tab in the outside of the stringer. Again, cut strips of fiberglass, mix up your resin, and then apply the fiberglass tabbing in. Once that has set and cured, your stringer is not moving anywhere. And essentially what you've done is you've created a fiberglass with your hardened resin, kind of a cushion between the bottom of the stringer and the hull, but you're not creating any pressure points because you've pressed in this stuff that's completely conforms to the wood and conforms to the hull. So it's even pressure along the hull the entire length rather than, one spot where it's rubbing and one where it isn't because of imperfections in the hull or your cutting of the wood or something like that. So And then after that, you just go along and fiberglass the stringers in the way I showed you earlier in this video. Anyway, hopefully this helps somebody, gives you a bit of an idea. There are many ways of doing it. I've just found that this works well for me. Anyway, till next time, see you later.